What is up, guys? Randomonium here. This is your Week 5 Fantasy LCS analysis and prediction video for the 2017 Summer Split. In this video, I'm going to be going over all the matchups for Week 5 for both NA and EU LCS, and I will be discussing all the results from the previous weeks, so if you haven't seen those matches and you do not want the results spoiled, this is your spoiler warning. And actually, this past week, I actually went up to Riot Games where they filmed the LCS, and I actually got to see TSM versus Echo Fox. I got to see Cloud9 versus Dignitas. So you might see me in the crowd if you watch those videos very closely. And it was an absolute blast. It was a ton of fun. It was only $15, so not basically the equivalent of a movie. And you basically get to go for 2 matches, which can last up to 6 hours. So it's a pretty good time for a pretty cheap price. And if you're in the LA area, I would highly recommend it. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with it. Got to high five all the TSM and Cloud9 players, and I also saw Pokey there, the streamer and YouTuber. And I thought it was kind of funny because she was sitting in the front row on the TSM side, and she only stayed for the TSM game, which is kind of hilarious because like Cloud9 was right after that. So I don't know if she just hates Cloud9 or she loves TSM, or if she hates Sneaky or loves Bjergsen. But I find it very weird that she's kind of just left like after the first match. So I know I'm kind of busting her balls a little bit, but it's kind of hilarious that there's all the jokes about her and Bjergsen, and she only sticks around for the TSM game. So that was pretty hilarious. But if you guys thought that Week 4 was a pretty spicy week, Week 5 is going to take it up to Ghost Pepper levels. This is going to be a ridiculously high risk week. There's going to be tons of high risk teams. Pretty much no team is safe right now, and this is going to be a very interesting week. I think there's going to be a lot of chances for upsets with Fantasy LCS. So that if you've been struggling with your Fantasy LCS teams, this is a good week to kind of right the ship and to go for some higher risks, and you might be able to knock off someone who's got a better team than you do. So we're gonna go through all the weeks real fast. So let's go through TSM real fast. I'm just going through their weeks. So week 1, they went 1-1. You can see they were C tier, B tier. Week 2, they went 1-1, but they were kind of a mix of S tier to B tier. And then week 3, they went 2-0, and they were S tier, A tier. And then week 4, they went 2-0, and they're S tier, A tier. So we're basically seeing this pattern where if TSM is able to go 2-0, they're basically S tier, A tier, and then if they drop a match, it depends on how close it is, right? If they are able to go 2-1, then they can usually stay kind of S tier, A tier, maybe a little bit of B tier. But if they get 0-2'd, which is rare, then they drop down to B tier, C tier, which is what we would expect. So if we look at Cloud9 kind of similar thing happens. They went 0-2 week 1, 2-0 week 2, 1-1 week 3, and they still performed very well in week 3, even though they went 1-1. And then week 4, this is kind of a weird one. They went 2-0, but their fantasy points were pretty awful. So this is kind of, you can kind of attribute this to, 1, the game's going too quickly, them not racking up a lot of kills. But Jensen is still able to perform week in and week out. So if there's one person that you should be looking at for Cloud9, it's Jensen. He's been the guy who's been performing, week in and week out. He's always been kind of top tier. So just keep that in mind. Phoenix 1 has started to have a little bit of resurgence with their roster changes. So we can see in week 1, bot lane was doing great even though they went 0-2. Then in week 2, they were pretty much bottom of the barrel every week. Week 3, Mike Young came in and he had a phenomenal week and he was S tier. And then week 4, lo and behold, they've got a pretty amazing week. They're S tier nearly across the entire board, even though they only go 1-1. So Phoenix 1 is definitely picking up the pace. The roster changes they've made are really good. It's definitely translating to a lot of success, and if Mike Young is available in your fantasy league, you probably want to pick him up because it's looking like he's been S tier for the past 2 weeks. So I think it's a pretty good bet that he might not be S tier every week, but he should be probably A tier at least every week. FlyQuest, kind of the bubble has kind of burst on them. They had such a promising spring split, and then this split has not been very good. So C tier the first week. They were able to get, decent with high and balls in week 2 because they went 1-1. Week 3 they went 0-2 and they were back into C tier again, and then week 4 they were 0-2 and they were D tier. So at this point, I would be benching most Fly players unless they have a really promising week. For CLG, CLG has actually looked pretty dang strong. So week 1 they came out guns blazing. They had Darshan was S tier, and then week 2 Darshan was S tier again, even though they were only 1-1. Week 3, Darshan S tier yet again, along with Stixay, and then week 4 just chaos broke loose. They got absolutely destroyed by Immortals, which really hurt their fantasy points, and they actually were near bottom of the barrel. So a lot of CLG's success is really tied to Darshan. If Darshan does well, then they can execute that 4-1 split push very effectively, and Immortals just had their number. Flame has been looking phenomenal. So yeah, CLG is very dependent upon Darshan being able to execute that split push. Dignitas is another team that has definitely improved since last split. So week 1 they actually went 2-0, but they didn't have very good fantasy points. Week 2 they went 1-1, still not very good fantasy points. Week 3 they went 2-0, also not good fantasy points. And then week 4 they went 0-2 and they had bad fantasy points. So Dignitas, even when they do well, they're not putting up the fantasy points we would expect. So I would say that unless Dignitas has a very good week, you probably want to avoid them. But if they do have a good week, then they could be a pretty solid pickup for, they probably won't make S tier, but they could probably be a solid A tier team. Immortals is another team that is probably the best team in NA right now, but they were a little bit hit or miss when it came to fantasy points. So week 1 they did very well, S tier and A tier across the board. Week 2 they went 1-1, went 0-2 against Envy, and then you can see they kind of dropped off, and they were C tier, D tier. Week 3 they came back 2-0, but they didn't really see it in the fantasy points. And then week 4, this is when we actually started seeing them, putting up the points. So week 4 they went 2-0. They were A tier across the board. I actually would have expected them to be a little bit higher, especially Flame, just because he's been looking so phenomenal. So I would say that, Immortals is actually underperforming a little bit when it comes to points compared to what their record is. But they're just a really good team, so it's hard to pick against them. Echo Fox has actually been a team that's actually been, in certain players, have been outperforming what you would expect. So first week they actually went 2-0, but only Froggen actually had good points. Week 2 they went 0-2, and it was only Froggen who had good points yet again. Week 3 they went 1-1, and actually the team actually performed pretty dang well across the board, and Froggen actually didn't get as many of the resources. And then week 4 they went 0-2, and they were pretty much bottom of the barrel. So with Echo Fox, their team points are usually actually pretty good. You can see they're number 1, and then they were S tier in week 1. And then Froggen does pretty well, but the rest of the team you can see is kind of hit or miss. So Froggen is definitely a good pickup. Maybe Looper. It looks like Looper has been probably the next most consistent person out of top lane. But yeah, I would definitely say that if you're going to play somebody from Echo Fox, it's probably going to be Froggen. Team Liquid is another team that has been doing a lot of roster changes. They're looking a little bit better, but they've pretty much been bottom of the barrel most of their weeks. They had that week 2 Piglet went kind of off, but they've been doing a lot of roster changes, and those roster changes aren't necessarily set in stone. So besides Piglet, I'd pretty much avoid Team Liquid for right now, and I probably wouldn't even play Piglet right now because Team Liquid is just they're in a free fall. They have no idea what they're doing. They're in danger of being relegated, and they're just throwing everything they can at the dartboard and hoping something sticks. And then Envy has been kind of inconsistent, I guess would be the best word to describe them. So week 1, went 1-1. in average fantasy points. Week 2, they actually did phenomenal, and they only were B tier. Week 3, they did horrible, and they were D tier. And then week 4, they did, pretty good, and they actually had decent fantasy points in top lane and jungle. So Envy is very inconsistent, which is why I can't really recommend them in a lot of those positions. Unless they've got like a really promising week, they might be a pocket pick. But for the most part, I'd probably avoid a lot of the Envy players until they show a little bit more consistency week in, week out. On the EU side, we've been seeing a lot of fluctuations with the teams because when you only have one match in a week and your points get doubled, that increases the volatility of the matchup a lot. And we see this a lot with the teams that only have one match in a given week. So, like, for example, the week 1, G2. So we'll start off with G2 and I'll get on to the other examples of people who only had one match in a week. So G2 had 3 substitutes in week 1. Can't really count that match against them. Week 2, they came back. They had a full roster lineup. They went 1-1, and the only person who performed well was Sven out of everybody. Week 3, they lost to Misfits, and they were pretty much C tier, D tier across the board. And then week 4, they lost to Unicorns of Love, but they actually improved a little bit in as far as their fantasy points are concerned. But Sven didn't do very well. So G2 right now, shockingly, is not a sure bet when it comes to fantasy points because you see that the team is struggling. They are not looking as invincible as they were in the spring split. It feels like the EU teams have stepped their game up, or it also might be a case of we see a lot of times teams coming out of the MSI, especially if they perform well, they don't really have a lot of time to recover, to kind of relax, to kind of de-stress, to kind of get their life in order before they start the summer split again. And we saw this happen with CLG, where they just took a nosedive after they had that really great performance at MSI, and G2, came off of an amazing performance at MSI, and they're seeing kind of the similar things. So it's it seems like that the MSI has a toll on teams in the summer split if they do well. But I do think the G2 should be able to recover. They're obviously going to make playoffs, but it's just a question of they might not get that top seed in their group if they're not careful. Unicorns of Love is another good example of a team that kind of highlights what can happen when you only have one match in a week. Week 1, they came out of the gates. They beat Vitality pretty easily. They were S tier across the board. Week 2, they had 2 matches, but they were able to 2-1 H2K, and they were able to stomp Monkeys, and they were kind of really actually split. So top, jungle, bot, and support did great, but mid lane and for their team points, they did actually pretty horrible. Week 3, they lost to Splice, they got upset, and you can see how they dropped off. They were only C tier, B tier, which is actually pretty good, because a lot of teams that would be 1-2 would actually be almost solidly C tier if that happened to them. And then week 4, this is the really weird one, is that they beat G2, but their fantasy points were horrible, which was what I would not expect, because Unicorns of Love has shown, split in and split out, that even when they do poorly, they can usually put up great fantasy points. So this is kind of a little bit disconcerting that Unicorns of Love is not as a surefire pick as maybe we thought they were. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider moving into week 5. The week 5, I think Unicorns of Love has got a pretty good matchup in week 5. We'll get into that in a little bit. Fnatic has probably been looking like, I would say that they might be the best team in EU right now. They've been looking absolutely phenomenal. Week 1, they just crushed everyone, S tier across the board. Week 2, they were able to upset G2, but they weren't able to reflect it that well in the fantasy points because they did drop that one game to G2. Week 3, they actually lost to Roccat, but they were still top team. So this was kind of very weird that they racked up a ton of fantasy points, but they still got that loss. And then week 4, they just absolutely dominated, and they were S tier across the board, and they were actually top in both top lane and jungle. So Fnatic's looking very, very strong moving into week 5. Misfits has been another team that has kind of struggled with the with the implementation of the way that the fantasy point scores in week 1. They went up against Fnatic and got destroyed, and they were D tier across the board. Week 2, they came back really strong, though. They were able to go 2-0, and you can see that they had a couple players who were S tier and a couple players who were A tier. Then week 3, they were able to beat G2, but you don't see the fantasy points come out. So this is just showing that just because you win your match, that one match of the week, doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed fantasy points. You really have to stomp the team. You actually have to 2-0 them to get those really high fantasy point scores. And if you get a 2-1, then that means that one of those matches counts as a win, only one of those matches counts as a loss. And if you didn't perform well in your loss, then that really hurts your fantasy point scores overall. And then coming back in week 4, we can see the vast contrast where they went up against Vitality. They racked up huge amounts of fantasy points in both games, even though they lost one of those games, and they were S tier across the board. So this week 3 to week 4 difference, you can see same result, 2-1 in both weeks, but the fantasy points are huge. And this is something that you have to consider with the EU players, is that all it takes is just one game where the other team snowballs and you can completely ruin your week, which is why I've been saying that a lot of these teams, when they only have one match for a week, they're very high risk. You're taking a gamble if you play more than one player from that team. H2K, this is a team that came out looking really strong, but I feel like it is kind of faltering a little bit, and it's kind of unclear if they've hit kind of like a mid-season slump or what. But week 1, they were S tier across the board. Week 2, they actually lost Unicorns of Love, but Odo and Yankos were still S tier. Week 3, they 2-0'd Vitality, and they were S tier across the board. And then week 4, they kind of had this flip-flop week where they went 1-1, and you can see that they're scattered all across the board. And actually, Odo, who's been doing really well, was actually one of the worst top laners when it came to fantasy points in week 4. So, and also like H2K, when I've been watching them, they just haven't been as clean as they were at the beginning of the split. So I'm not really sure what's going on with them, if it's just, a fluke or if it's just a mid-season slump. But H2K is not looking as good as they did at the beginning of the split or at the end of the spring split. Splice is another team that always puts up a lot of fantasy points, kind of like Unicorns of Love. We can see in week 1, this is kind of the exception to the rule. They got absolutely destroyed, were D tier across the board, but then they came back very strong in week 2 and were S tier across the board when they went 2-0 in both of their matches. Week 3, they were able to get that upset across Unicorns of Love. They went 2-1. You can see across the board they were S tier because those matches went really long, but they didn't get a lot of fantasy, or they didn't get a lot of team points because of the team points are based off of towers. You get an objective to control and things like that. And then week 4, they went up against Rockcat, and surprisingly, Rockcat got a 2-1. They lost, but they still took a game off of Splice, which I thought was surprising. And Splice was, near the S tier across the board yet again. So Splice is looking pretty strong as long as they've got a decent week. But if they don't have a decent week, you can look back at week 1 and you can see like how bad things can go for Splice if they get O2'd. So just keep that in the back of your head, is that if you think that they can win their match, they're probably a good starter. But if they're more likely to lose, they lose hard, it seems like, when they lose. So just keep that in mind. Vitality, haven't really seen much from Vitality. So week 1, D tier across the board. Week 2, D tier across the board. Week 3, C tier across the board, and that's with them winning a game. So they won against Monkeys 2-0, and they were still C tier across the board. And then week 4, actually saw some improvement. Cabo and Nuke Duck actually, showed up and played pretty well. So they're definitely on the rise, but I don't think that you really want to pick anybody up yet, unless you want to take that gamble, unless you feel like they've got a really good chance at winning. But I don't feel like Vitality is very consistent yet. Rockcat has been a team that I've actually had my eye on a lot. I think they felt kind of embarrassed. They still lost to G2 with 3 substitutes. They had decent fantasy points in week 1, but they still lost. Week 2, they lost to Misfits, and they kind of, were pretty bad when it came to fantasy points. But then they started coming back. So week 3, they were able to get a 2-0, and you can see that they had some decent fantasy points showing, but not great. And then week 4, they lost to Splice, but they still put up better fantasy points in this week than they did in the previous week. So if you actually look at like the total number of points for the split, Rocket is actually not bad at all. They're kind of middle of the pack. So if your fantasy league is not going the way you want to, and you're getting a lot of really low point scores, there are certain weeks where you might want to rotate in Rocket players because they might be able to perform for you. But you got to be very selective with your weeks and when you play them and when you bench them. And then at the bottom, we've got Monkeys and Ninjas. And needless to say, they're not doing very well. Monkeys has done some roster changes that I think are actually for the best. But, they had actually a pretty fun match against Fnatic. But you can see it didn't translate into the fantasy points. So I definitely would not be picking up anybody on Monkeys or Ninjas in Pajamas for week 5. So let's go into week 5. So you can see that I've got a ton of teams over in the high risk, high reward category. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But my S tier teams for this week are Unicorns of Love, G2, and Fnatic. And the reason for this is that G2 has got Monkeys, Unicorns of Love has got Ninjas, and Fnatic has Splice. So I think that Unicorns of Love and G2 should be able to dominate both Monkeys and Ninjas. And I do think that Fnatic should be able to beat Splice pretty easily. I would be surprised if Splice takes a game off Fnatic, because Fnatic has just been looking really strong. Not impossible, but I definitely say it's low risk, which is why you can see that I've actually got Splice way over in D category. This is just not a good week for them. I feel like they're just way too high risk to justify playing this week. For my A tier, I've got some surprises here. I've got CLG, I've got Dignitas, and I've got actually Echo Fox. So let's talk about the one that's kind of the more common one, which would be CLG. So CLG's got Cloud9, they've got Team Liquid this week. I do feel like Cloud9 is the better team, but CLG, I feel like they're coming off kind of a really bad performance in week 4, and usually really good teams, they tend to bounce back from a bad week. So I think that the CLG team that's going to show up against Cloud9 is probably going to be really, really strong. That's actually going to be a really hard-fought match. And then Team Liquid, I think that CLG should be able to beat them pretty easily, which should give CLG some decent fantasy points. They might not be S tier, but I think they're pretty solid picks, especially like if you got Darshan, he would be probably a good person to start this week. Dignitas, we kind of talked about how they haven't been putting up the fantasy points we would expect them to based on their results. But this week they've got FlyQuest and they've got Envy. These are both teams that Dignitas can beat, but they're probably not going to smash them. So I do think that this will drive up Dignitas' point values a little bit, because the games might go a little bit longer. They might rack up a few more kills, things like that, and that's going to allow them to get a few more fantasy points. So while I don't think that they're going to reach, the S tier status, I do think that they're decent picks to pick up. They're some of the more safer picks this week to pick up. And then Echo Fox, they're going up against Team Liquid, and they're going up against FlyQuest. And I think that Echo Fox is a better team than both Team Liquid and FlyQuest right now. If you've got Froggen, I think that Froggen is definitely a good person to pick up and play this week. Acadian is another one, and Looper is another one. I'm not too confident in the bot lane of Echo Fox right now, but also their team points are actually, they put up a lot of team points. So this could be a good week for if you have a bad team, then you might want to pick up Echo Fox this week to try and get some more team points. For the B tier, this is where I've got a lot of teams, because there's a lot of really strong head-to-head matchups here. So I've got TSM, I've got Immortals, I've got Cloud9, I've got Rockhat, I've got H2K, Misfits, and Vitality. So TSM, going up against Cloud9 and Immortals. These are two really tough teams for TSM, and it's really a coin toss. I really think that probably both of these matches are going to go to a game 3, which probably means that it's going to hurt TSM's fantasy points. They're most likely only going to be around B tier, based off of the losing one game out of every single match at a minimum. It's hard to say if TSM is going to be able to. I do think that they have the capability to beat Immortals and Cloud9. I think that giving them a slightly more of an edge against Cloud9 than Immortals. I think Immortals is probably the best team in NA right now. It's going to be hard to say. I think that TSM and Immortals are definitely the top two. So this will pretty much decide who's the kings of NA for the summer split right now. Immortals also has TSM and Phoenix 1. So the reason why I've got Immortals slightly lower risk is because they've got that Phoenix 1 matchup. So that does give them a little bit more leeway, but Phoenix 1 has definitely looked better. So this isn't a match that Immortals can look past. So I think that Immortals is definitely the lowest risk, highest reward out of all of these high risk teams, but they're still high risk because they could lose to TSM, they could lose to Phoenix 1. I don't think it's likely, but it's definitely a week to be a little bit worried about Immortals being able to rack up those fantasy points. Cloud9, they've got TSM and they've got CLG, and I already talked about, I do think that TSM's got a slight advantage against Cloud9, and then CLG, I feel like they're going to bounce back pretty strongly into this week, so that gives Cloud9 two very hard matchups, which is why they're a little bit higher risk. But I do think that they also are very high reward, especially Jensen. Jensen is probably going to still put up S tier points no matter how well or how poorly Cloud9 does. Another one that's probably surprising for people is I've got Rockcat up here. I've got Rockcat up here because they're going up against Vitality. And I do think that Rockcat can beat Vitality. I actually would not be surprised if Rockcat actually 2-0'd Vitality, because Rockcat has shown some flashes of brilliance. And actually, if you are struggling in your fantasy league, like I'm actually struggling in a couple of my fantasy leagues, I'm picking up Rockcat players this week. In those fantasy leagues where I am struggling, I'm kind of doubling down and going for a high-risk play on Rockcat players because a lot of Rockcat players are available. So if you feel like you've got a pretty weak team this week and you feel like you've got to take a gamble in order to have a shot to win, I think Rockcat's a pretty good bet because they're probably going to have a lot of players available for Rockcat. But I wouldn't just sell off your entire team. Don't trade Bjergsen for a Rockcat player or something like that. Only trade off your bench players and stuff like that to sub in the Rockcat players. H2K, they're another one that is high risk because they've only got one matchup this week and they're going against Misfits. So it's hard to say who's going to show up, right? On paper, I think H2K is the better team than Misfits. But H2K has been looking really shaky. So this really is a coin flip. And Misfits has been known to spoil people, to upset people. So this is a really high-risk matchup. And my thoughts are is that more likely than not, neither team is going to win from a fantasy points perspective, which is why I have them so high risk. The only way that this turns out good for H2K or Misfits is if one of those teams 2-0s the other, which I don't think is going to happen just based off of the skill level of both teams and how competitive they both are. And the final team in the B tier I've got is Vitality, and I have them as the highest risk but lowest reward in this category just because I do give Rockcat the advantage. That said, this could be a good week for Vitality. So, I would say Cabo is probably your best bet on Vitality, but it's very high risk, and I'd probably just go with the Rockcat players over the Vitality players personally. But, if you guys disagree with me, then feel free to prove me wrong and stack your team with Vitality players this week. You can see I've only got one C-tier team this week, and that's Phoenix 1. Phoenix One has got Envy, and they've got Immortals. And the reason why I've got them C tier is I can definitely see them winning one of these matches, but I don't see them winning both of them. Like, I feel like if depending on how much they focus on Immortals, they could get upset by Envy. Envy is no team to slouch on, especially Phoenix One, who's been struggling a lot. And if they try to focus too much on Envy to make sure that they are able to secure the win against Envy, I feel like Immortals could definitely steamroll them, because Immortals is one of the top teams in NA. So I think the most likely result from this week is that Phoenix One is going to be going 1-1, which is going to put them around that C tier, maybe B tier. I definitely think that like Mike Young and Arrow are probably your two best bets when it comes to fantasy points on Phoenix One. I probably avoid Zig, because Zig hasn't been putting up a lot of fantasy points. He's been getting picked on a lot. And then for D tier, I've got Splice, Envy, Team Liquid, FlyQuest, Monkeys, and Ninja's Pajamas. We already kind of covered a lot of these matchups. So Splice is going up against Fnatic, which is why I feel like they're just way too high risk to play this week. Envy's got Phoenix One and Dignitas, which is going to be difficult for them for both of those matchups. I don't think it's outside their capability to win, but I would definitely say the odds are stacked against them. Team Liquid is going through a lot of different roster change-ups, and it seems like they are looking better, but I still think that this is going to be a growing week for them, and they're going up against Echo Fox and CLG, so I don't give them that much of a shot to beat either of those teams. FlyQuest has just, I don't know what's going on with them. They've just completely lost their mojo. They're going to be against Dignitas and Echo Fox. I think that both of those teams will beat FlyQuest. And then we already talked about Monkeys and Ninja's Pajamas. Monkeys is going against G2, and Ninjas and Pajamas is going to give it to Unicorn to Love, which is why I've got them the lowest reward, because I do think that those are extreme long shots that they would be able to upset a Unicorn to Love or G2. So that's it. Those are my predictions for week 5. This is going to be an absolute barn burner of a week. This is going to really define who are the top teams in both NA and EU LCS. And we've got a lot of really close matchups here. With Rocket going against Vitality, and TSM going up against Immortals, and TSM going up against Cloud9. There are a ton of really great matches this week. Also, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I did take some photos while I was up at the LCS, so I'll probably post those in the video description below if you guys want to check them out. And yeah, I highly recommend you guys go watch a live viewing of the LCS, or if they're coming to your town for like playoffs or something like that, then try to save up for that. I think it's worth it. To go to one of those big venues. I definitely, if they host the playoffs in the LA area or on the West Coast, I'll probably try to get tickets to go there, because it was a lot of fun going up and seeing those matches live, getting the energy from the crowd and stuff. So if you have any questions, as always, I'm happy to answer them, happy to help you guys out. It definitely helps me out if you let me know, just take a snapshot of your team and your opposing team. That's usually the easiest way for me to give you advice, because who you want to start will really depend on not only who do you have on your team, but also who the enemy has on their team. So, yep, happy to help you guys out whenever way I can, and hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Randomonium, signing off.